Ruth chapter 2 in your Bibles now. What Pastor John was saying about sermon manuscripts is pretty much always the case. If you've ever missed something and it would be easier for you to read it than hear it or watch it, you can at any time ask for a copy of the sermon manuscripts. It's kind of fun anyways to figure out where I deviated from what I had written. You know, you can kind of see what I actually preached compared to what I wrote. But seriously, that's always just email us anytime and we can get those to you if that would be helpful for you. Or even if there was just a section where I was citing references and you didn't get them written down or something like that, just let me know. We are continuing our study of the book of Ruth, as Pastor John said. Pastor Eric is gone today. They are in Washington, D.C. for family vacation. So Pastor John ended up filling in at the last minute for us. So thankful for that. We continue the book of Ruth, and in particular, we are jumping back into the middle of a sermon that began last Sunday morning about Boaz, and it has now become clear that it will continue through next Sunday morning as well. So this is Boaz part 2 of 3, Lord willing. With most of the men in the Old Testament, as we noted last week, we see their sinful failures. And so we are pointed by them to Jesus because their failures show us the need for him. Their failures show us the need for a perfect prophet, a perfect priest, a perfect king, even a perfect man and a perfect human, the second Adam. Boaz, however, is portrayed differently, maybe more along the lines of Joseph. He is, of course, a sinner who had sinful failures that we could have been told about, but we were not. And so I think, and by the way, I should pause and say that what I said at the very beginning of this series, that the characters in Ruth are in some ways open to different types of interpretation of some of their actions, and particularly the motives for some of their actions. And so it is possible for someone to find potential failings by Boaz in this story. I don't really, that's not the way I see these things, but it is possible. But even if that is the case, dominantly, Boaz is portrayed in a very positive way. And so my point is that both kinds of portrayals point us to Jesus. The portrayals of sinful failures point us to the need for Jesus. The portrayals of strength and love and obedience and the positive things then foreshadow Christ and point us to their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. They give us Old Testament hints of what Jesus would be like, and that is how I understand Boaz, one of those characters who gives us a foreshadowing of Jesus in a very remarkable way, and at the same time portrays true manhood in a way that is very important for Christian men today. This is probably too much information, but I have bit both of my cheeks a few times the last couple days and have sores in both of my cheeks that really hurt. So if I don't quite seem right, like facially or something this morning, it's because I'm trying to talk to my mouth without moving my cheeks. So I hate to distract with that, but I don't want it to be a distraction. So if I look like I'm angry at you or something, it's because I can't really smile very well. So I apologize for that in advance. So in this book, Boaz is called a mighty man. And so we see here a depiction of what true might looks like. So last Sunday we began a list of some of these characteristics. Boaz, as you see on your handout, Boaz foreshadows Jesus, the ultimate mighty man, because, number one, he was a relative who qualified to redeem Naomi's family as Jesus took on humanity, became one of us to be our Redeemer. Secondly, he showed favor when Ruth was certain that she would be rejected or worse. She found favor instead. When the Spirit convicts us of our sin, we know that God should reject us. We don't expect his favor. Yet Jesus died for us, and so he does not cast out anyone who comes to him for mercy. In him we have all of God's favor welcoming us as his precious children. I had a man I spoke to this week who had a drill sergeant view of Jesus, and he was just sure that Jesus was disappointed that he said to me, Jesus likes strong people. Jesus likes tough people. Jesus likes fighters. And it was such a joy to tell him the promises of Jesus, that he does not cast out anyone who comes to him for mercy, and that it is Jesus' strength and our strength that saves us. So Boaz pictures that in the favor that he showed to Ruth when she was sure she would be rejected. Number 3, Boaz was devout. He was a man who put a high priority on God and the importance of God's presence and blessing. And of course, Jesus then did that perfectly. And then fourthly, Boaz was respectful. And we're using that term there not in a very kind of simplistic way like we teach our kids to, maybe speak to adults or something. We're using that more seriously to refer to treating someone as a human being, someone of precious value. And so Boaz, Ruth expected Boaz to be heartless, but what we saw was that he spoke to her with heart. Ruth expected harshness and received gentleness. Ruth expected to be treated as an object, and he treated her as a person. And so those things are just a beautiful foreshadowing of how Jesus would treat sinners. So we're going to add 3 more to the list this morning, and Lord willing, 5 more next Sunday. But before we get into those, I want to remind you, because one of you reminded me correctly last week, that Boaz was a real man, as we said in week 1, a real man in a very dark time in Israel's history. And so this Christ-like character that we see that developed in Boaz didn't just suddenly appear. God developed it in Boaz somehow. Now, the book doesn't tell us anything about how that happened, how God developed that character, but he did. God's grace did work in Boaz. God did shape him into a mighty man. Boaz wasn't born a mighty man, right? He was born with the same need for God to give him a new heart and transform him through his grace, and God did that. And so the fact that that happened, remember Judges? Remember how we trace through the consequences for the women in the book of Judges because the men did what was right in their own eyes? The fact that Boaz shows us that God's grace could reach into that kind of a dark time and transform any man or any woman means that God can do it in any circumstances today. There cannot be an excuse based on who I am or what my personality is or what my dad was like or anything. God's grace is enough to make a man look like Jesus by a new heart and then by his sanctifying work. So, there's not really anything else I can say about how Boaz became this kind of a man because the Bible doesn't tell us anything. But it's well worth noting that God's grace was sufficient to do that. All right, let's get back into our story, Ruth 2, verse 1. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And as we saw last week, that means probably, number 1, we're hungry, I got to go find food. And number 2, hopefully I'm going to find somebody who won't kick me out. And so the end of verse 2, Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And as we saw last week, that phrase, "she happened to come," says she chanced upon the part of the field belonging to Boaz. And the writer is obviously saying, look, like this is a extremely lucky circumstance when it's so clear from the story that the point is it was God, right? She just so happened to end up in this field, right where God was doing what he was doing. Verse 4, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Okay, first question. Verse 8. Why did Boaz say, "Don't go glean in another field or leave this one"? I don't think he's referring to another one of his fields. I think he's referring to the fields of someone else. He was telling her to stay in his fields. Now, why did he do that? Did he want to marry her? Was it love at first sight, and he didn't want anyone else to have love at first sight too? So stay here? Or did he know he was going to redeem this family, so he wanted her to stay to make sure he could do that? Well, I don't think, based on the book, either of those possibilities seems likely. Boaz doesn't seem to recognize the redemption possibility or think of marrying Ruth until probably 6 weeks later when she appealed to him to do so. So why did he tell her to stay in his fields? Well, the Bible tells us. And the next 2 points on our list are the Bible's answers to that question. First of all, Boaz wanted to protect her. So in our outline, number 5, Boaz foreshadows Jesus because he protected. The end of verse 8, keep close to my young women. And verse 9, let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? So there were probably men hired to cut the grain and women hired to come along and gather it. And Boaz told her to stay with the women in his fields. That would afford her some protection. And then he went further. He had already gone further and charged the young man not to touch her. That word is as vague in Hebrew as it is in English, but it could refer to anything from harassment to physical or sexual violence. And later in the chapter, when Ruth told Naomi about this, if you'll look with me at Ruth 2, verse 21, and Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." Your translation might use a different word, and again, that's just because this is another Hebrew word that can have a pretty broad range of meaning, from metaphorically being referring to like harassment to something much worse and physical. So there were 3 parts to the protection. Stay in his fields rather than risking coming across evil men in other fields. Stay with his female employees and know that his men had been charged not to touch her. He lived in a day of horrible mistreatment of women, as the book of Judges shows us, and he stood as the antithesis of that. He saw himself as a protector, not because he was trying to impress Ruth, but because it was right. It was his character. This is not a guy who's saying, "Don't worry, honey, you stay by me and I'll always take care of you," just to sound cool and chivalrous. It was his heart and his character to protect. It is sad to consider then the contrast with his great-grandson, King David, who, when he saw another vulnerable woman, was not a protector, but rather he instead assaulted her. That is the right word for what David did when he's the person in authority in that situation. One of the transformations of mind and heart that helps a man win victory over lustful thinking is to learn to look on women as valuable people to be protected, rather than as objects to be used. I don't care how much feminism hates the idea that women need the protection of men. I don't care. I just ask you to imagine a world in which every man did all that he could do to protect the women in his life from harm. And you have a better world than this one. In all of this, Boaz points us to Jesus, who treated women with the utmost care and respect. But even more importantly, he is the great shepherd who protects the souls of his sheep forever. Boaz protected. So that gives us one of the reasons why Boaz asked her to stay in his fields. There is another reason, another motive Boaz had. He wanted to provide for Ruth and for Naomi. By the way, let me back up and take a rabbit trail out in the notes very briefly. Men, young men, however you treat a girl whom you're interested in must be consistent with the character you had before you met the girl. Or you're playing a game and you'll be a terrible husband because you won't be like that once you get the girl. Girls, if he is a knight in shining armor for you and not in his home with the people closest to him, run away. Frankly, if he's a knight in shining armor for you and anybody in his life, not just the people closest to him, if he treats you great and doesn't treat other people consistently great, if he protects you and doesn't protect other people consistently, if he speaks kindly to you and doesn't speak kindly to other people consistently, no matter who they are, run away. Boys play games. You can put on certain types of character in narrow relationships for a narrow amount of time that you cannot maintain in all of your relationships for the long term. So boys, develop the character first, then demonstrate to the girl that you have developed that character by the grace of God. And girls, listen to people who know the boy. And if they tell you, be careful, don't say, well, I know him. You know how he treats you. That is not the same thing as knowing him. If the people in his life, and especially the people closest to him, can testify to a heart for Jesus and Christ-like character that's thorough in his relationships, then marry him as fast as you can. That was an overstatement, but you know my point. Do what Ruth did and go ask him to marry you. I'm going to make you wait 5 Sundays before we preach on that. Yep. All right. Where in the world am I? We're on point 6. Number 6, Boaz foreshadows Jesus because he provided. He provided. He wanted to provide for Ruth. He wanted to provide for Naomi. He wanted Ruth to be able to stay there all the way through the harvest and bring home an abundance of food. We just saw this in verse 21, where Ruth reported that Boaz told her to stay throughout the harvest, which was probably another 6 weeks or so. And then look back up at verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So rather than just gathering accidental scraps, Boaz made sure she would get full sheaves, as if she was harvesting her own field. And then look at verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. Verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. That the way that is worded there in verse 19, Naomi is like stumbling over her words. In other words, she is astonished at the amount of grain that Ruth brought home. Now, it's hard to know exactly how much it was, but maybe something like 6 to 10 gallons of grain. So For two hungry people, this was like going to the store to get a loaf of bread and coming home with your trunk full of groceries. And so Naomi is like, where have you been? What have you doing? Where did you work today? How did this happen? And it happens again in the story. Ruth chapter 3, verse 15. Boaz says to Ruth, bring the garment that you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. So we don't know what this is. You see, it says in verse 17, 6 measures. Well, we don't know what measurements it is. So depending on which measurement you pick, there's something, she has something like somewhere between 18 and 300 pounds of grain. So Boaz's heart of provision is right there at the end of verse 17. You must not go back empty-handed. And I'm reading into the text, I admit it. But in verse 16, when her mother-in-law says, how did you fare, my daughter? Okay, even if she only has 18 pounds of grain, it's still obvious how she fared. So I'm just picturing Naomi, over the stove working, and Ruth comes in like, "Argh!" And Naomi's like, how did you fare, my daughter? And Ruth's like, well, turn around, and I will show you. In addition to all the grain, at the end of chapter 2, verse 9, we read, see chapter 2, verse 9, when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Let me quote from Daniel Block. In a cultural context in which normally foreigners would draw water for Israelites and women would draw water for men, Boaz's authorization of Ruth to drink from water his men had drawn is indeed extraordinary. So these things alone would suffice to show that Boaz was determined to provide for Ruth and for Naomi. But verse 14 goes even further. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. There are so many things that are unusual here. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this is not like a guy meets a girl and thinks she's cute and tells her that if she'll stick with him, he'll always take care of her, and then he takes her to a nice restaurant for a meal. This is so far from that kind of modern day scenario. As I read about this and learned, the word I just kept coming across over and over again was extraordinary. It's so unusual what happens here. So first of all, it's unusual that Boaz was providing a meal for his workers. That itself is unusual. Then it's unusual that he's eating with them himself. None of this is what we would expect according to custom. But then it's even more unusual, far more startling for him to invite this Moabite woman to join them for the meal. And Ruth knew this was unusual because you see what his first words are in verse 14? They are, come here. She was obviously not expecting to participate in the meal. She was off on the side somewhere, and he called her over, inviting her to come take this meal, have some bread and dip it in this sauce that they made from sour wine. And the surprises in verse 14 just keep coming and coming because he's got this meal for his workers. He's eating with them. He summons Ruth to come over and eat with them. And then it says in the middle of verse 14, she sat beside the reapers and he passed to her roasted grain. The Hebrew wording just makes it very clear that he, by his own hand, took the grain and passed it to her. He served her himself. Now, again, these things may not sound unusual in our day, because in our day, meals aren't these big symbols of fellowship like they used to be. In our day, people of different races and nationalities mingle together all the time. In our day, bosses commonly mingle with employees. In our day, men and women work and eat together, and all that is not unusual. But in that time, this was all very startling. Boaz's heart was to protect and to provide. So we are reminded of Jesus, who called himself the bread of life, the the living bread that nourishes our souls and is always enough. And even more specifically, this little meal vignette here in verse 14 just fits into this big Bible theme of a meal, being welcomed at a meal, and even the theme of people eating with God. And it just ties together in some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful ways. Not all of which we can talk through this morning, but I'll show you a little bit. The Bible uses a meal to picture how fully and completely God has welcomed us. God, invites us to come and eat with us and even to be served by him. Let me just show you a couple highlights of that. First of all, will you turn with me back to Exodus 24. Sorry, Exodus 24. Exodus chapters 20 through 24 are what we call the Book of the Covenant. It is essentially the giving of the law of Moses to Israel. Now, there are lots of other laws that were explained in more detail and other things later, but Exodus 20 through 24 is kind of a package that gives us the Book of the Covenant that God made with them. And that covenant is confirmed in Exodus chapter 24. So this is God coming. Okay, so for the first time since Adam and Eve, this is God entering into a covenant relationship with humanity, bringing them into a relationship with himself. And that covenant is confirmed in Exodus 24, and the chapter begins with God saying to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." So Moses goes, and those 73 others with him, and the covenant is confirmed. And then we read in Exodus 24, verse 9, then Moses and 24:9, then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. In other words, somehow they did not die in God's presence. They beheld God and ate and drank. Now, I don't know what that means, but, beyond what it just tells us. But they went up part way. God said, don't go any further except Moses. And then it says, they went up, they saw the God of Israel, they didn't die when they should have, they beheld God, and they ate and drank. In God's presence is the obvious implication there. And so even though there's a lot of mystery there, and I don't understand much of what's going on there, it then just becomes this theme that just keeps that just keeps showing up in the Bible. Like Psalm 23:4, what does it say? The Lord, as our shepherd, prepares a table before us. The Lord prepares a meal for us in the presence of our enemies. If we jump to the end of the Bible, Revelation 19:9, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage, what is it? Supper, the marriage feast of the Lamb. And Revelation 21:6, to the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. So, somehow God's purpose is to fellowship with his people in full welcome and communion. And in those ancient cultures, you couldn't picture full welcome and communion any better than by eating together. So remember how Jesus got in trouble for eating with sinners? Luke. And then there were his parables about this, including Luke 12:37. This parable of the master who goes away and his servants are waiting for him and the master comes back. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, which means, sit down, lay down for the meal, and he will come and serve them. Now, admittedly, that's a parable, but it's a parable about the servants of Jesus. And so the implication is that when Jesus comes again, his servants will be invited to a meal, told to sit down for this meal, and he himself will serve them. Does that sound like Ruth 2:14? Boaz, who called Ruth to this meal and then served her himself? And there's one more story that, there's a lot more that connects, but one story that just really seems to connect with this. Will you turn to 2 Samuel chapter 9? Some of you will probably know this already and be aware of this, but if it's new for some of you, I think it might be an exciting kind of new. It's a story that connects with Boaz and Ruth and Jesus and us. So this is a story about Boaz's great-grandson, David. David was the second king of Israel, following Saul, the first king. And while Saul was king, he became, he was foolish. It's interesting, Saul, remember how we talked about the time of the judges and then Elimelech and Naomi and the idea of I just have to do this, even though it's not what's right? It's exactly what Saul did. Coming out of the time of the judges, Israel's first king says, I just have to do this, and does foolish things that mean the Lord takes away his right to reign. So David's anointed king, but Saul's still reigning, and David is having all these victories, and Saul's getting really jealous, and Saul ends up wasting the end of his reign, just obsessed, completely obsessed with finding and killing David. And while all that was going on, one of the ways in which God protected David was through Saul's son, Jonathan, because Jonathan and David were friends. And Jonathan knew that David was going to become king. So what does it mean for the king's son when somebody else is going to become king? It means you're going to die, right? Because you're a serious threat to the next king, and so you're going to get killed along with everybody else in your family. And so Jonathan and David made this pact together. And David promised Jonathan that he would show loyal love to his household. And then Jonathan died. He actually didn't die when David became king. He died earlier when in a battle along with his father. And so when 2 Samuel 9 begins, David has become king officially, and David remembers that pact he made with Jonathan. And so as the chapter begins, he wants to know if any of Jonathan's household has survived. Is there any descendant of Jonathan left to whom he could show loyal love? So let's read now, 2 Samuel 9, verse 1. And David said, Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul, whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. Don't kill me. And the king said, Is there not still someone in the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. The king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage and said, Don't kill me. Right? Like that is what's going on there. He's thinking, don't kill me. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. Don't kill me. And David said to him, first words, do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both of his feet. Wow, do you see the gospel all over that story? But do you see Ruth and Boaz all over that story too? Verse 10, David made sure that Mephibosheth's whole household, all his servants, Ziba and his whole family, that they would have plenty of bread to eat. But then for Mephibosheth himself, the greatest honor that he could give him, verse 11, was the privilege of eating at the king's table like one of the king's sons. And he says, "Why are you showing regard for a dead dog like me?" Why does he call himself a dead dog? Well, it's probably not completely parallel, but it's something like saying in modern terms, "I'm dead meat." Right? There's no reason for David to show the least bit of favor to me. He should just take my life because I'm an heir from the previous king. I'm nothing. Remember that's probably how Ruth felt when she went out though to those fields, and she was just hoping that somebody in some field wouldn't harass her or assault her or kick her out and make her leave. Somebody would let her get some food. She too was an outsider who had every reason to expect to be treated harshly and even harmed, but instead she was welcomed, summoned to come eat, and fully provided for. And all of this. So David and Mephibosheth, Boaz and Ruth, the marriage supper of the Lamb, the elders of Israel eating with God in Exodus 24, all of it ties together with the parable in Luke chapter 9, Jesus calling himself the bread of life. It points us right to Jesus, doesn't it? We too are the outsiders, separated from God by our sin, facing Jesus as judge. But instead, he summons us to his table. He welcomes us to a fellowship meal. He provides for us the bread of life, and he even serves us himself. So last fall, we learned Jesus Thank You as one of our songs of the month. This is right there in Jesus Thank You. By your perfect sacrifice, I've been brought near. Boaz summoned Ruth. Come here. Come near. Revelation, you're called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Another parable Jesus told, the king says, "Go out in the highways and the byways, into the hedges, and summon them, compel them to come into my banquet, to this feast." Jesus summons us to his table. By your perfect sacrifice, I've been brought near. Your enemy, you've made your friend. And then in the chorus, once your enemy, now, what's the next phrase in Jesus Thank You? Seated at your table. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for giving your own life as the bread of life, dying that we might have that bread of life. Thank you for taking our separation from God so that we might be welcome to the king's table, to God's table, with the king's sons, to God's fellowship and provision forever. Boaz provided, and in that he foreshadowed Jesus. That flows right into number 7, our final point for this morning. Boaz satisfied. Ruth 2. We got to turn back to Ruth 2, huh? Ruth 2 and verse 14 again. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. In verse 18, She took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. She took home a to-go box for her mother-in-law. The gospel picture is so clear. Satisfied, eating all that she wants, and has some left over too. John 6:35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. To a woman at the well who is trying to find satisfaction, a Samaritan woman not welcome in Israel, by the way, Jesus said, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. John 4, verses 13 and 14. The world offers things that are intentionally designed to leave you thirsty, so that you have to keep coming back for something else, something new, something more. But there is a bread of life that rises above the relentless search for satisfaction. You know why? It's because the one who made you knows what satisfies your soul better than the world does. That's why Jesus is the bread of life. And just as Boaz ensured that Ruth had more than enough, so the Bible says that when Jesus fed the 5,000, they all ate and were satisfied. And then they collected baskets full of whatever was left over. It says in Psalm 23:4 that with the Lord as our shepherd, our cup does what? Overflows. And Jesus told that woman of Samaria that those who drink his water that discover that it becomes a fountain pouring out with eternal life. You drink normal water and the cup goes empty. You drink this water and the cup becomes a fountain. How does that work? Jesus satisfies. Boaz could satisfy with a meal. Jesus can satisfy a soul for eternity. We're going to stop there for this morning and come back next week and talk about how Boaz redeemed, sacrificed, gave rest, kept his promises, and finished the work. So what is this story about? Is it about a man doing lavish things because he falls for a woman? That doesn't seem to be what's going on, at least based on what the Bible tells us. Rather, here we have a man of character. We have a true, mighty man doing what was right, what honored the Lord, doing what God, by his grace, had shaped in his heart and life and character. It was right to protect. It was right to make sure that Naomi and her family had food. It was right to provide water for Ruth as she worked. It was right to make sure she was satisfied and had more to take home. Men, do what is right, not just what will get you what you want. This is what honors God, the way he created things to be among the people he created. And men, if you submit your life to Jesus and seek him, these are some of the areas that will change. You'll become a protector as Jesus changes you. You will become a provider as Jesus changes you. You will more and more have a heart that wants to protect and provide for everyone around you. Oh, how much our world needs this. When so many men, and we must admit, sometimes even Christian men, are more focused on using women than protecting and providing for them. When women live in the fear of how men might harm them rather than the comfort of knowing that men will protect them. Our world needs this, which means our world needs Jesus and men shaped by him. Our families need this. But the greatest motive is that God is honored by this. When Jesus takes his word and gives you a new heart, and by his grace and his spirit, you submit to Jesus and seek Jesus, and he starts to shape you one step at a time to be like Jesus, then God sees in you a reflection of his Son, and that pleases him. He's honored. And in you is seen a reflection of his Son that other people see. And so his glory spreads. See? It is ultimately for the glory of God. So men, seek Jesus and seek this kind of change to be like Jesus. And ladies, I'm letting you off the hook, but it applies to you too, right? And we'll get to Ruth soon. But But those practical applications, of course, I keep pointing us rather to Jesus for all of us. And so ultimately the story is about how in Jesus God protects, provides, and satisfies. And so really the overall question is, are you looking to Jesus for those things? Are you looking to Jesus for favor and respect and provision and satisfaction, or looking somewhere else? As we heard in last Sunday's offertory, you can have all this world, but give me Jesus. And as we heard in this Sunday's, the new song of the month, I will rejoice in my Redeemer, greatest treasure, wellspring of my soul. I will trust in him, no other. My soul is satisfied in him alone. So ultimately the book of Ruth asks all of us, where are you looking? Is it Jesus?